our last plenary, and we kind of saved the best for the last. So it is my great honor and privilege to introduce to you our keynote speaker, Paul GIfford, whose name rings a bell, world-renowned, Emeritus Professor of African Christianity at the University of London School of Oriental and African Studies. Paul GIfford has been researching different varieties of African Christianity for over 30 years, including 2 years of researching on All African Conference of Churches, AACC, the umbrella body of the mainline Protestant churches in Africa. Paul has written several books on the subject, especially Christianity and Politics in Those Liberia, Christian Churches and the Democratization of Africa, African Christianity, Its Public Role, Ghana's New Christianity, Pentecostalism in a Globalizing African Economy, and most recently, Christianity, Development and Modernity in Africa. Has also just completed 2 studies of religion and the Muslim Brotherhoods in Senegal, forthcoming in the Journal of Contemporary Religion and African Affairs. Presently, Paul lives in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. He's been with us for the last 3 days or so, and I have gotten to know him closely, and I must say how wonderful it is to meet him in person, the kind of the deep love he has for Africa. And this, I'm sure, will be on full display, not just his love, but also the deep insight he has about this beautiful continent. Paul will be speaking on the spirit in Africa. So I invite you to please join me in welcoming Professor Paul GIfford.
Thank you so much for inviting me to this symposium. I've learned so much and established contact with so many colleagues with similar interests. So I'm very grateful for that. There'll be no PowerPoint. One of the drawbacks about speaking last at a colloquium is that you have no idea of all that you've prepared, how many issues will be totally thrashed out by the time your turn comes. Let me begin by quoting James Barr. He gave a lecture once, and the introduction really stuck in my mind. He began by saying, as an academic, it's not my job to be right, it's my job to say what I think as clearly and as carefully as I can. Where I am wrong, I rely on you to correct me. So that's the spirit in which these remarks are made. At the outset, let me quote a book by an English theologian, Nineham, Christianity, Medieval and Modern. In describing medieval Christianity of Europe around the year 1000, he highlights points like the following. Europeans at that time had a very inadequate idea of the past. They had little idea of change. They had almost no interest in the natural world. Society was divided hierarchically, the religious, aristocracy, the peasants, with women virtually nowhere. Their life was almost literally nasty, brutish, and short. And with so little understanding of secondary causes, the evils that continually befell them were assumed to be punishments from God, with all the consequences this had for their understanding of their own sin, guilt, and worthlessness. God must indeed be angry with these people, it was felt, if he visited so much suffering upon them. Since so little was known about the workings of nature, it was easy for what happened to be experienced as supernatural intervention. The supernatural was the really real. Without technology to help them, the clergy were the only people believed capable of understanding what was going on and of producing, by their prayers and sacramental activities, the results which the age desperately needed, but had not the knowledge to produce by secular means. Ninum's point is that all dimensions of life cohere. They form what Trelch called a totalität. Without demanding absolute tidiness, religion for most is lived more than theorized. But it's therefore problematic to isolate one aspect of this context, reify it, and think it has relevance to the purportedly same element in another totally different totalität. Thus, to make normative the refusal to ordain women, or a belief in a personal devil without taking into account the complete set of beliefs and values surrounding both areas, is very problematic. One might add others. To take over the stress on divine wrath to a culture not built on honour or authority, to transpose an understanding of natural law from a culture with little knowledge of or interest in nature, to elevate that use of the Bible from a society with such a different understanding of the past. I don't want to spend time discussing medieval Christianity, which I'm not particularly equipped to discuss anyway, but his main point, I think, is a good one. The coherence of all elements within a totalität, and how problematic this makes trans-temporal comparison or transposing an element in one totality or complex or totalität, isolating it from the other components which gave that element its particular significance. It's rather too rash to presume that such an element in isolation is directly identifiable with or comparable to what on the face of it might seem exactly the same element in other complexes. I think this point has significance not just historically, but geographically. In short, when we embark on what might seem a simple comparison between, say, Winners Chapel in Lagos and John Wimber's Vineyard Church in California, all sorts of issues arise. The contexts, economic, cultural, historical, political, and intellectual, are so very different that identifications with or comparison between an element in one and that supposed element in the other, though obviously not impossible, is far more fraught than often realized. Today I want to make that point in reference to comparing the notion of spirit in Africa and spirit in the West. Right at the outset, let me be clear. Of course, Africa is as much a generalization as the West. Of course, Botswana is not Niger. Guinea-Bissau is not Kenya. They have significant differences, and which in particular contexts may prove determinative. But one can make claims for Europe, quite aware of the differences between Ireland and Sicily, between Sweden and Italy. One can talk of the United States, acutely aware of the real differences between California and Mississippi, and the differences of both from Vermont. You can talk about them, provided you make the appropriate provisos and qualifications. I will talk of Africa today while giving examples from Senegal, just because I've lived there for most of the last 5 years, and for reasons which I hope will become obvious. But I won't be claiming that Senegal is normative or representative of Africa in any hard sense. Nevertheless, I think it allows me to make valid points of more general application. So my first point religion in Senegal. In Senegal, the pervasive religious imagination sees spiritual forces operative everywhere and understands causality primarily in spiritual terms and worldly events as determined primarily in the spiritual realm. Let's call this, with a nod to Max Weber, the enchanted religious imagination. These spirit forces can be manipulated by individuals gifted with such powers, whose services are available to those who seek them. This gifted individual is in West Africa called a marabout, someone who claims power over the sacred and symbolic forces affecting our lives. And maraboutage is the use of that power. Manipulating the spiritual forces affecting us is aimed at ends like the following: to enjoy prosperity, to enjoy status and popularity, to control another, particularly in amatory matters or for extracting money, to restrict another's physical movement, to cause division between others, out of motives of jealousy or revenge or material interest, to render oneself invisible, so one might, for example, pass through immigration or customs unobserved, to cause sickness or death at a distance, to avoid blows or attacks on one person, to obtain general protection from malevolent others, to send another into exile and vagabondage, or by contrast, to bring another back to the country, to find love, to make someone impotent on his marriage night, to drive someone to death or to suicide. Obviously, some of these can be considered positive aims, but it's evident that most frequently the negative outweigh the positive, though some can be considered both. Manipulating spirits to ensure the health, harmony and prosperity of one's family, on the face of it, seems something positive. However, often there is a downside. Working to ensure promotion can entail the failure or firing of a competitor. To find love may mean eliminating rivals, especially in a polygamous society where the spiritual manipulation is often used to discredit, render infertile, or ensure dismissal of a co-wife. Even if influencing spirits can be practiced anywhere, there are some places which have an aura or charge which make them particularly suitable. Places like trees, crossroads, beds, lintels, markets, morgues, wells, anthills. Some of these of their nature lend themselves to negative spiritual manipulation, morgues, cemeteries, some to positive, in Senegal most notably the mosque. Some can lead in either direction. Trees with fruit, sap, foliage and roots can possess a positive charge, but because they are considered the abode of spirits, they can also have a negative charge. Wells with association of life-giving water can lead in positive directions, but the hidden, cold, dark associations can also lead in negative directions. In all cases, the marabout lays down specific and particular requirements. Requirements that you must comply with to manage these spiritual forces. Concoctions requiring ingredients like powder, roots, salt, sugar, perfume to be mixed in various ways. Objects, knives, nails, needles, rings, coins, bones or other parts of animals, even humans. These are often made into talisman, or what is called in West Africa, gris-gris. In all maraboutage, there's normally a certain objective or subjective resemblance between what is sought and what is used. A part can represent the whole, and to act on a part is considered to be acting on the whole, and to act on something representing the person is considered acting on the person itself. Objects can be used in various ways, like baths, potions, lotions, sacrifices of all sorts, camels, cattle, sheep, chicken are common, and offerings are essential, both to begin negotiations with the marabout and to ensure the success of the process. Failure to observe the most minute of these stipulations can cause the process to fail, constituting something of an escape clause. It's almost impossible, it's effectively impossible to falsify this process. Spirits are manipulated for all aspects of daily life: love, business, travel, politics, not least relations between colleagues, husbands and wives, neighbours. For men, the most common demands are for wealth, promotion, status and power. For women, the most common are for love and domestic realities, a husband, children, domestic security. Women seem particularly prone to these spirit practices, probably because of their more vulnerable and marginalised place in society and the prevalence of polygamous marriages. This is religion in Senegal, the detecting, identifying and controlling the spirit forces that affect us. It pervades all areas of life and all classes, the elite as well as peasants, the educated as well as the illiterate. Yet it is hardly studied, something to which I shall return. Ibrahima Sow, a Senegalese professor at the university there, notes on coming to do his research, he's the one who has studied this, and I'm grateful to his work for much of this. He notes that when he came to do his work, he could find virtually no treatment of the phenomenon to build on. Nor is it a matter debated in serious fora. You can't miss it in the key fields of politics, football, the national sport of loot, but it's really only the middle range and popular media, especially the middle range newspapers, that feature the phenomenon regularly, not least the often bizarre charges brought before the courts against false marabouts or charlatans. Now increasingly the talkback radio covers this considerably also. This enchanted religious imagination is not unchanging, yet it would be misleading to say that it is disappearing. In fact, most observers say that the phenomenon is, on the contrary, increasing. Now, the second part of this talk, I won't do it all, but it's basically outlining various examples of this phenomenon of mysterious. So the application or the working out of this mindset in Senegal: mysterious deaths, particularly around election time, disappearances, kidnappings, can all disclose this religious imagination. Inevitably so, with corpses discovered missing various limbs or organs. In Tambacounda, a big city in the inland, about a year ago, there was a spate of killing intellectually handicapped people whose bodies were discovered minus limbs, particularly the penis. And with elections coming up, everybody made the connection, and it was true that many people commented on the lack of comment about this. I mean, there was a national outcry, but many people commented on that troubling silence on the part of local politicians. One commentator observed, in this town, traditional religions, secret societies, and circles of initiates constitute a parallel world whose links with politicians are close, complex, and often mutually supporting. finding talismans or gree-gree is often reported in these papers, like the Minister of Finance will find a gree-gree behind his curtain in his office. This will become national news because obviously somebody is trying to manipulate him. Show business, again, is fiercely connected with maraboutage. One child one day produced his first record at 13, then had another 20 years gap, explained the slight dip in his career from maraboutage. The world of showbiz is rotten. I can tell you that I was the victim of mystical attacks which fixed me. I consider that it's these mystical attacks which have held back my career. Senegal's national sport, lutte avec frappe. It's a kind of wrestling, but it permits punching as well. It's more popular than football, is as much a spiritual contest between the wrestlers marabouts as a physical contest between the wrestlers themselves. At the bout, the wrestlers are bedecked with gree-gree containing protective barks and other substances and douse themselves with protective liquids. I cite the much touted contest between Tafatine and Balagai in June 2013, effectively for primacy in Senegal. 2 days before the bout, Tafatine's camp had sacrificed a bull at a crossroads, dividing the meat into 64 portions as an offering. On the day itself, he had a black and white sheep sacrificed at his door. He'd stepped over the blood before sprinkling himself with blackish liquid. He took with him 5 calabashes decorated with Quranic texts. On the day itself, in fact, Balagai he won very quickly. Tafatine claimed he had been marabouted. He had been crippled mystically. He'd been forced to enter the arena through a door that had been mined. As a result, when the bout began, he could not lift his arms, and his opponent became invisible. And marabouts, Tafatine had 50 marabouts at his midday meeting before the bout. Tafatine's father admitted that he had paid at least 50 million CFA francs. That's 100,000 American dollars, and in Senegal that's a fortune. He'd paid 100,000 American dollars to marabouts to ensure his son's success, and insight into the economics of maraboutage, a topic in itself, but beyond our concern today. In an equally hyped bout, when Balagai was finally defeated after about a year as number 1 by Emeritus, after the bout, Emeritus said he was goaded to this because the grave of his recently deceased mother had been tampered with by Balagai's camp. Balagai denied this, but the allegation dominated the media for days. If the alleged deed drew universal disapproval, it seemed equally agreed that such activities were part and parcel of the world of loot. The theme of one newspaper's headline was "The horrible face of loot, human sacrifices, tomb profanation, suspicious deaths." SOAS suggests the courts are one place where this imagination can be seen in all its variety. There are so many cases involving false marabouts or charlatans, thus cases of fraud, but which nevertheless reveal this religious imagination I'm examining. In good many, the charlatan actually seeks out his victim, claims to be a powerful marabout of a great religious family, even the marabout of the president or some other prominent figure, often telling her, or most often a woman, that she may soon die or suffer some serious loss unless she submits to his prescriptions for sacrifice, offerings, mystical baths. Sometimes the convincing will be done by accomplices. I've got examples here. I won't. I used to go down to because of the subject is not studied, I used to go to the courthouse, and the main courthouse in Dakar. There's about 12 individual courtrooms, and almost invariably there's a case of maraboutage being tried, charlatans being sued for what they did. And this is my field work, I suppose. Sell accepts that the label of charlatan has wide applications, but it is equally clear that it would be a serious misunderstanding to reduce all marabouts to charlatans. I won't go on, but my examples are taken from courts in the major cities, which to me suggests that these are the mere tip of the iceberg. But the cases are frequent and surprise nobody. They're evidence of this widespread religious imagination on which charlatans can play. The claimants to powers over the spirits are variously described as marabout, charlatan, féticheur, maître coranique, faiseur du miracle. In nearly all cases, the victim is initially convinced by the charlatan's claims and follows his demands completely. Mystical baths, prayers, blessed water, talismans, incense, candles, Quranic verses, rings, and so on. And in the courthouse, you'll hear them say they were put to sleep, they were hypnotized, they were bewitched, they were held under a spell, they were maraboutés, overcome by arms not conventional, and so on. Even if the magistrates in most cases find the charlatans guilty, there seems little doubt that many observers in court and many of the journalists covering these cases accept that mystical powers are in play, even if for evil ends. Now, to return to the considerations with which I began, this idea of a totalité, of a totality, of a coherent complex. The connotations connoted when talking of spirit in that context are very different from the connotations of spirit in the context of the West, where enchanted religion has ceased to have much traction. Thus, comparing the charismatic movement of, say, the Archdiocese of Dakar with the charismatic group at the University of Minnesota is not as easy as might be thought, because spirit in Senegal has such widely different connotations from the same idea in Minnesota. My third point, which I've got labelling. If then this is Senegal's religion, the detecting, identifying and controlling the spirit forces that affect us, complications set in, because nearly all Senegalese would claim to be Muslims. You look up a reference book, 90% of Senegalese are Muslims. Virtually all marabouts are members of brotherhoods, and very often the requirements demanded involve recitation of Quranic verses or drinking them. Certainly one might argue that Islam has an affinity with some of these practices. For example, Muhammad himself cast out demons, which leaves the door open to detecting the influence of spirits and to diverse forms of exorcism. The fact that Muhammad himself was bewitched can even encourage the practice, from the argument, how much more vulnerable am I to exactly the same fate? I give some examples which I won't give here, but the fusing of the non-Islamic, even anti-Islamic, with Islam seems usually accepted, even unnoticed, but not invariably. I mentioned the bout between Tafatine and Balagai in June 2013. Well, there the combination of Islam with the marabouts and what they call fetishism was so obtrusive that it actually drew protests from several of the main religious families, and even a march to the headquarters of LUT demanding that the Quran should not be used like this in future. Thus, labeling this religion is complicated. What do you call it? SOAS suggests that the basic worldview is traditional and often in large measure opposed to Quranic orthodoxy or even to the spirit of Sufi mysticism. It seems hard to disagree with SOAS that practices which it has not been possible to abolish have been Islamicized. He says much engagement with spirits might more strictly be called analogical, participative, or symbolic magic. He claims in this matter the distinction between religious and magic is hard to draw. As I say, normally there's no problem with Islam. Islam has been rather tolerant, but the tension is becoming more evident now. There are outside pressures urging a more Quranic Islam, notably Iran and Saudi Arabia, for whom there is little sympathy with Sufism of any sort, much less of the brotherhoods as they operate in Senegal. Saudi and Iranian-trained and sponsored imams are insistent on their calls to pure Islam, which are often thinly veiled criticism of the form found in Senegal. Now, my fourth point. Transpose all this to Christianity. You might ask whether the observations just made apply equally to African Christianity. There is the big difference. Islam has been largely prepared to accept the blending of Islamic and pre- or extra-Islamic. Christianity is far more reluctant. All the mainline churches, with their roots in the West and their massive involvement in development, have traditionally been very wary of enchanted religion. More, official Catholicism is positively opposed. Vatican II, I think, can be seen in this light. Whereas sometimes it is claimed that Vatican II was opening up to all cultures, in fact, Vatican II was bringing Catholicism into line with the modern Western world. Here's a quote from Comoro and Civilon. Civilon went on to be the Superior General of the Maryknoll Fathers. At this time he was teaching anthropology in Dar es Salaam. He writes, the worldview and cosmology of pre-Vatican II Roman Catholicism were in fact an enculturated understanding based on a culture and consciousness very similar to traditional African culture. Vatican II, while marking an opening up to the world, was in fact opening up to a worldview and culture of modernity that are quite different from African culture. As the Church accommodated itself to scientific and secularized culture, it moved dramatically away from the cultures of indigenous people around the world. The reluctance to address this enchanted religious imagination gave rise to the phenomenon of dual allegiance. You might go to church, go to Mass on a Sunday morning, but on the Tuesday evening you'd sneak away to a healer diviner to have your issues addressed. In my opinion, here lies the explanation for the exceptional success of Pentecostalism in Africa. Finally, a form of Christianity has become acceptable that gives full range to the enchanted religious imagination. You no longer have to sneak off on a Tuesday night. It can all be done during the service on Sunday morning. The Catholic charismatic movement is sometimes said to do the same. In some countries, the Catholic charismatic movement has become integrated into the official church, but in many other countries it has not. There are people here who know far more about Catholic charismatic Christianity than myself, but it seems to me that it is very often a step on the way to full-fledged enchanted Christianity rather than an attempt to integrate aspects of this into Catholicism. My fifth point, very briefly, conversion. This raises the problematic issue of conversion, such as the almost paradigmatic status of Paul's experience on the road to Damascus, that the word conversion normally implies some significant change in attitudes or worldview. Yet I think it's obvious from the study of Senegal that attitudes and worldview often persist in an entirely different religion. In 2012, countless Muslims, by far outnumbering Christians, attended a crusade in Senegal conducted by the Ghanaian Pentecostal Dag Heward-Mills. The Muslims all went not out of any idea of conversion, but because Heward-Mills, his publicity indicated he had more power over spiritual realities than the local marabouts. Heward-Mills insists that he has raised the dead. My sixth point, the reluctance to address this enchanted religious imagination in Christianity. Sal remarks that it's very hard to find this phenomenon studied. When he began, there were no books he could draw on. This captures my reservations about enculturation theologians. It would seem to me that this would be the first thing they would deal with. I suspect I know why they don't. African theologians, with their priority of asserting African culture, are determined not to draw attention to witches and spells that the West dismisses as superstition. They're writing for the West, where the idea that spiritual forces cause mundane events has ceased to have much traction. Many of you know of the anthropologist Mary Douglas, who actually spent quite a bit of her career here at Northwestern. She was a devout Catholic, and she wrote, not long before she died, in the tablet on the problem of evil. She said, for the Catholic Church, with its coordinated and centralized doctrines, there is a problem. Doctrines about sin and evil are not minor peripheral matters. On such a central issue, the Church in the industrial West is isolated. It does not believe in the devil. Should it, can it impose its historically unique view, peculiar to certain intellectual circles in the West, upon the rest of the Church? Trying to talk to African philosophers and theologians about the place of sorcery beliefs in Christianity, I received the strong impression that the subject was delicate. They are very aware of the disbelief of their fellow Christians from the West. They do not want to quarrel or expose themselves to ridicule, so their ways of dealing with the devil are driven underground. A frank discussion of sorcery and Satanism is only just beginning to emerge. She says, my personal view is that the third world theologian should take up these problems without regard to the contemporary bias of Western theology. The teaching on evil will come from Africa, and that is what Africanization will mean. I think Mary was wrong. The discussion of sorcery and Satanism has not begun to emerge. The teaching on evil is not coming from Africa. Seventh, my final point, assessing enchanted religion. What can one say about the enchanted imagination? I think much depends on what level one addresses it. I'm in a study of religions department. I'm just an old-fashioned ethnographer who goes to churches and observes. For me, I essentially try to study it, establish the reality, and describe it. That's very different from addressing the issue on a theological level. A Catholic theologian has a different agenda. A theologian could hardly argue that the enchanted religious imagination is incompatible with Christianity. In fact, Peter Brown has even claimed that for early Christianity, the greatest single reason for its triumph was that it was superior to its rivals precisely in its claim to have conquered the spirits so threatening to inhabitants of the late Roman Empire. Most forms of Christianity throughout history have surely been enchanted. Such thinking was prominent in the West, as shown by a book like Cameron's Enchanted Europe. And for a theologian, unlike the Iranians and Saudis claiming that the religious imagination is un-Quranic, a Christian theologian could not argue that it's unbiblical. It can obviously be found in the Bible. In fact, the Bible can be reduced to a handbook for combating spells and witches, as I've just published an article in the Journal of Theology in South Africa on Olokoya's Bible. King James Version, like the Schofield Bible or like the Women's Study Bible, the Bible reduced to, he wouldn't see it that way, but the Bible, a handbook for combating witches and evil spirits. So a theologian is operating on one level, but there's another level on which the enchanted imagination, religious imagination, can be addressed, on the level of department studies, if one can so speak. I would argue that the world changed in the last couple of centuries, and one of the most remarkable changes, one of the most remarkable features of that change is the superseding of the enchanted imagination by a functional rationality which seeks specific means to specific ends. The world now operates on different principles which have led to penicillin, air travel, and computers, and of course, atomic bombs, chemical warfare, and global warming. But that's the world we live in. If Africa is to join this world, what place is there for enchanted thinking? Ibrahima Sow can study the phenomenon with considerable empathy, but claims this way of imagining reality belongs to another age, something which must change if Senegal is to join the modern world. The enchanted world is not a world of established physical laws and rights, but one in which anything can be done or undone, provided one finds the right marabou. For Sow, what he calls a recrudescence of this imagination, far from developing the country, threatens to plunge Senegal into obscurantism. Just a couple of years ago, a man received a 6-month jail sentence for penis snatching, defended by the tribunal president on the grounds that Africa has its own realities and mysteries.
I really don't understand what it means for Africa to take its rightful place in the world. On whose terms and what criteria? Because it seems to me that when we talk about Africa taking its rightful place in the world is abandoning everything that it has, including enchanted religiosity, and taking on the so-called scientific, rational dimensions of the so-called modern world. But question is, can Africa do both?
Keep its.
Okay, yes. We have been arguing for some years. Basically what I mean is I think Africa, why can't Africa have, say, firms like Sony, Mercedes, Apple, Rolls-Royce? Why can't Africa be up there with university league tables? Why can't Africa win prizes for medicine, chemistry, that sort of stuff? That's the sort of thing I have in mind. And to do that, I think some changes would be needed, like teaching physics, teaching chemistry, research budgets, all this sort of thing, and introducing those things would require change. So I'm more open to change than you are. Yes.
Thank you, Prof, for the presentation. Let me start from where you have left regarding chemistry, biology, and other things. I think that's, I think in a sense, that's where the problem is. That when the missionaries came to Africa and teach religion, I think the study of religion right now in Africa is done on a patronage level. We teach and come to present papers here in the West because that's where the voices of the West are. So if the West is interested in the rituals.
Sorry, if the West is?
I mean, the themes which the academics are busy researching on seem to be dictated by the motifs in the West.
Yeah.
It seems like exactly what you are saying, that the enchanted worldview of Africa has not yet been researched. Why? Because the discourse of religious studies in Africa has not yet been weaned from the interest of the West. And part of that is that most academics in Africa are trained here in the West, which also creates the problem of epistemology. And perhaps that also answers the question of why are these issues not researched on? It's because they don't have consumers.
They don't have?
Consumers in Africa. There are no readers of these issues. And if a book is published, who consumes the issues of religious studies in Africa? Academics in London, academics in the West, and less by the people who are in Africa themselves. And I think that goes back to the question of publication, the questions of the curriculum itself. It's not a question really, but I think that's where the problem could be.
Yeah, thank you. I don't see myself physics, chemistry, those sorts of things as Western culture. To me, physics and that's just the way the modern world operates. And sure, these things had to begin somewhere, and in fact they began in the West. But I mean, you can argue about social sciences and so on with validity, no doubt. But when it comes to the things that I've been mentioning, physics and chemistry, I think they're relatively easy. Let me stop there. It's much more complicated if you go a bit further. Yeah. Yeah.
One question. I would like to challenge a bit. Does modernization come automatically with a functional, rational worldview that wipes away the enchanted worldview? Is it not rather the lesson from globalization that it comes with tempus mixtus, that we have mixed times, and you have modern, pre-modern, and post-modern spheres at the same time, so, and that what we see here, what our theme, charismatic Christianity, is a sign of that, and the fact that, I mean, Catholic priests all over are learning now, again, exorcism is also a sign of that. So the Vatican II modern era is maybe closing a little.
Yes, perhaps. Yes, you may very well be right. Yeah, to some degree, we probably have different ideas of what it means to be modern. By modern, I don't mean just existing in the 21st century. I mean actually holding one's own. The world is a complicated, competitive place. And to actually make it in that world is fairly difficult. You've got to work hard at it. And it's no reflection on the people of Somalia, who God knows have suffered enough. But I don't call Somalia a modern country, nor Eritrea, nor South Sudan, nor Chad, nor the Central African Republic. They exist in the 21st century, but I don't call them modern. I mean, modernity is a complicated thing. I'm helped by that. If you ever see it, there's a book by Norman Davies, I think it's The History of Europe. His first appendix is 50 things, signs of modernity, the modern world. They range from everything: railways, newspapers, universal education, sort of political parties. It goes right to organised sport, organised crime. So it's not, but these are the sorts of things that he puts down, and I know it's a very vague term, and you can come at it from all sorts of angles, but so on. But well, I've had my say. I'll let it rest. But these are my views. Yes, yeah.
Prof, I just want to ask a simple question. Where does the study of the enchanted worldviews of Africans lie within the epistemology and knowledge production that is capable of producing the interest you have in Africa in terms of chemistry, sciences, and whatever you were talking about? How do we, what epistemological position do we come from in order to study this enchanted worldviews, the whole enchanted space of Africa? It's a very pertinent question. Because it does look like we still have, I don't want to use the word academics, commentators, who believe that it's this same enchanted space and the enchanted worldview actually that still keep Africa somewhere crawling within the ladder of development and then call the developing world. So which epistemological tool would you advise that is used to study this enchanted worldview?
Well, I have Senegalese scholars who would argue that. I know plenty of people argue differently, that the enchanted religion is another form of modernity. I've yet to be convinced of that. I was going to say I'm open to be convinced. Probably that's not true. But Ibrahim himself, for example, he would say, no, there's no future for Senegal unless it stops imprisoning people for penis snatching. That's not me, that's him. That's first at the university. I mean, I'll come clean. I I'm in a study of religion department, but my wife works for the United Nations. The last 40 years we've been living in Africa. She's been working for education in Africa. So I study religion, but my big interest is, I probably get from her, development. Now I know all these debates about development and so on, but that's a bit off the beaten track today. But I'm in the development, I'm not in the development business, but I support it like anything. And I do ask the question, as Ibrahim Sow does this way of thinking help or hinder Africa? He says it hinders. I'm aware that some in the West say it doesn't. Many of you will be aware of Ferguson's articles, 20 years old now, about the tension between development studies and anthropology, with his wonderful sentence, the tension fundamentally, development is disliked by a discipline that at heart loves all those things development intends to destroy. And I often think there's some truth in that. Yeah. And that would be where I would differ from enculturation theologians. I don't want to go down that track. To me, culture is just the way we see or do things. To smuggle the idea of that culture includes something special, something untouchable, something eternal, something, I find I'm quite prepared to jettison elements of culture if they would help Africa, what I would say, Africa to take its rightful place in the modern world. And I know you think I'm a bit simplistic, but very simplistic, with taking its rightful place, having firms like Mercedes, Sony, Apple, this sort of thing. But I think it's not the whole thing, but at least it would be a start. Gary?
Yeah, thanks, Paul, for your talk. It was very engaging. And while you were speaking, a book came to mind, and I'd like to ask your opinion of this book. One that I like very much, but my colleagues dislike very much. So I would love nothing more than to go back to Philadelphia and tell them, Paul GIfford loves this book, so it must be good. And you mentioned that women have a proclivity to enter the enchanted spirit world and seek services of marabout, and you associate that with vulnerability and marginalization. So the book that came to mind was I.M. Lewis's Ecstatic Religions, of course. And I'm wondering whether you think that that book could help us understand the gender dimensions of the enchanted spirit imagination and the marketplace. And if so, great. Then I can go back to Philadelphia with some ammunition for my debate. So surely you probably knew him personally, I would imagine, the great British Empire. And his own fieldwork was in the Horn of Africa, the Tsar calls.
I'm reluctant to be dragged into your debates down at England. That's why, although I did notice the way you the way you introduced the notion of modernity, vulnerability of women because of modernity. I don't know whether their vulnerability comes about as a result of modernity. I would tend to the view that it was ever thus, wasn't it? Why?
Well, right. Lewis associates it with oppression. So his position is that women are twice as likely to be possessed by spirits because they are twice as likely to be oppressed materially in society.
Yes. Although I think it's important to stress what I'm talking about is not really possession. That was mentioned yesterday too. There are many churches where possession is of the essence. I'm not talking about that necessarily here. In fact, possession in Senegal would be quite small. Even Pentecostal churches, I think someone mentioned it, Africa's Pentecostal churches, it's not really a case of possession. People are exuberant and the worship is exhilarating, but when the pastor says stop, they stop. people were praying in tongues, and I'm standing here. I say, excuse me, I want to go now. And they say, okay, see you tomorrow, and then let me through and then go back to speaking in tongues. So there is a bit of a confusion. There are those possession cults in Africa, yes, certainly. And Terry Ranger, so on, for example, in Zimbabwe, that ethnography is wonderful. But I'm not talking about that here. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Yeah, thank you. I'll ask you later outside if you'd like the book.
Right, so I'll speak up for anthropology a little bit. First of all, just in response to the Q&A right now. So, well, I think Ferguson's critique of development is really valid, because his critique of development is much more one of sort of depoliticizing, and that's one thing that's I've heard totally missing in this, right? I mean, there's something very ahistoric about what the picture you've just presented here. I realize this is preliminary, like it's not the whole thing. Something very ahistoric, and there's something that's really pro-capitalist, and both of those things are perhaps spurious. We can leave those to one side. But I do think this sort of image of anthropology as a discipline that is concerned with preserving a sort of not undeveloped or pre-developed or pre-modern version of Africa is a caricature of that. I don't think that there are many people. We said we wanted to fight. I don't think there are many people in the discipline who would believe that. More to the point, though, what I heard in the paper was a sort of questioning of a framework of comparison, right? So you're talking about this culture as a totality, right? And that in that framework of sort of bounded wholes, cultures of bounded wholes, you want to be careful about extracting a particular element from one whole and comparing that to what is ostensibly a comparable element in that other whole, right? That was the key point in the talk. Comparison is definitely a bugbear in the study of a world religion in particular, whether that's Islam or indeed Christianity, because as soon as you start sort of playing the comparison game, it becomes very difficult to compare Ethiopian Orthodoxy to the vineyard in Southern California. What do these things have in common? And yet, I do think they can be productively compared. And in fact, I think there have been really robust frameworks for comparison that have been proposed in anthropology in particular. So one of those is to say Christianity is a set of affordances. That's Webkeen's term that he uses for that. Or Christianity is a set of elements that gets configured differently in different places, but is still recognizable across the board. So, to me, it seems a little bit unhelpful to sort of hold that to sort of eschew comparison out of hand in this way, but then equally to treat cultures as simultaneously bounded and advocate for their shift. This, to me, it seems equally then disingenuous to sort of advocate a view of culture as sort of bounded and discrete, which again I don't think is right, but then likewise advocate for something like an internal change and shift, a la development in this case. So to me this felt a little schizophrenic, I guess, in terms of multiple voices.
No, thank you. I quoted Ferguson, not supporting him, but that sentence from Ferguson. I'm not supporting that article at all, and anyway, it's very passé. But it is an interesting comment, and I do think there's an element of that in the inculturation theology debate. That's basically what I'm saying.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah.
I'll take that.
The capitalism charge, yeah, maybe that sticks.
Capitalism hasn't
That
been
doesn't
super great
commit
for
me. Sorry.
Capitalism hasn't been super great for Africa, for most Africans. Anyway, that's.
No, yes, I take that, and also the debate about development. I'm well aware of that. I'm up to here in it all the time at home. But to some degree, joining the modern world does mean sort of competing, paying your way. Now, I don't know how that would work in a non-capitalist way. It would seem to me some form of capitalism is the only game in town. So to some degree competing means to some degree getting into that race. Yeah. We can talk about this, but I just don't see any other alternatives. But the development thing, I take that, I'm well aware of it. I myself, though, I think I could defend the sort of development my wife does is not exploitative. And the whole, and what's more, the system that she operates on, I don't see that as exploitative, although I'm well aware of the charges that it is. What was the?
It was a comparison question.
Oh, yes, exactly. No, I think that's what I was trying to say. It's a bit more fraught than often thought. That's all I'm saying. That, I mean, I have plenty of doctoral students who compare this with that. So I'm not anti, but very often they do have to be reminded, hold on, it's rather different. Even, that would have been my reaction to some of the talks in the last couple of days. Pentecostalism in the United States, I think, is actually very different from Pentecostalism in Nigeria. Some elements are very similar, and the prosperity gospel, for example, I think relates quite well to much of what's going on here. But the sort of thing I'm talking about here tonight, I think that would be much less pronounced than Pentecostalism in the United States. I mean, I go around the African churches in London, and again, I think African immigrant churches do illustrate a lot of these points that I was talking about tonight. But your assemblies of God at around Brompton and so none of this. Yeah. And even, I mean, I've written about Otabills, for example. You can find African Pentecostal churches that positively denounce this worldview. Otabil in Ghana, there's no future for Africa unless we stop seeing it like this. So I'm not an anti, there's a good comparison, Otabil, say, versus Duncan Williams. I'm all in favour of comparison, but I do think sometimes the whole connotation, what this word actually means, well, what this reality is in this context, is not exactly the same as the reality here. Yeah.
Maybe I want to pick up on exactly that point, and I don't know if this is similar to the point that Naomi was questioning you on, but it seems to me like what you just said there, that one thing in one context is very different from another context. That strikes a note of kind of particularism, which seems at odds with the kind of note of universalism then when you talk about modernity. And as you do in your book as well, you criticize the idea of multiple modernities, and you have this idea that there's just one modernity. And so the note from Ninum that you struck at the beginning of the paper seems to me to be at cross purposes with that other kind of note of there's just one modernity and you can either join it or not. And so I'm wondering if we can't kind of pull apart this idea of the modern world a little bit and I mean, is it not possible to be pro-chemistry and anti-penis snatching, right? I mean, is it not possible to be pro-development but anti-Mercedes-Benz kind of development? I mean, the kind of grassroots development that, Emmanuel Katongo, I mean, so many people are talking about, which is a kind of integral development which, comes from the grassroots and respects local traditions rather than just kind of coming in and bulldozing them in the way that, James Scott describes so well. And it sounds like the kind of work that your wife is doing, the kind of, grassroots, ground up sort of thing. I mean, do we have to describe that as a kind of modernity, or could we say that it's something else? Rather than just kind of joining the modern world, we could describe that in a different way that would allow for other possibilities to happen. In other words, I mean, in one sense, you're right that there is this modern world, but it exists more as a kind of ideological construct than it does as simply the way things are. I mean, calling it the way things are is itself an ideological construct which makes certain kinds of things seem inevitable that aren't inevitable. And so that's, sorry, that wasn't a question, wasn't it? It was a, so what do you think of that?
No, you may very well be right about modernities. The point I was making in the book that I have not yet had it proved to me that there are other. I'm quite. I think on this one I am rather open. That idea that some people believe in witchcraft, others believe in development. They're both equally abstract nouns with capital letters. They're on a totally similar footing, and one's as good as the other. I just am not convinced by that.
Me neither. I mean, that's why I'm trying to distinguish between, penis snatching on the one hand and kind of, grassroots development that doesn't include Mercedes-Benz on the other hand. I mean, I'm trying to kind of pull these notions apart so that we don't have to kind of either buy the whole package of modernity, whatever that means, or reject it. Like, the choice you present is rather stark, right? There's modernity or there's enchanted worldview, and you gotta pick one. And I'm trying to get to the idea.
That's a bit stronger than I actually intended. You've either got this or you've got, as I say, someone like Otabil in Ghana, thoroughly Pentecostal, thoroughly African. You've seen him wearing his robes and so on, $400 about a time. But he won't have this, but he wants to be thoroughly African. I came across it as a bit stronger than I intended. Basically, though, grassroots development, I'm all in favour of it. It's just that we've got to do something pretty quickly. Ethiopia at the moment has 96 million inhabitants. There will be 253 million by the end of the century. Now, nobody can cope with that. We've got to come up with something. Jobs for people, education for people. The exodus from Syria will be as nothing to the exodus from Ethiopia before too long. Grassroots development I'm all in favour of. It's mighty slow. Do we have the time? I mean, or can we speed it up? Can we achieve more? I'd hate to be thought to be sort of backing the whole sort of capitalism as it is, Wall Street business, but some form of a capitalist economy is just the only show in town, I think. And unless Africa gets on board, I come back to my problem.
Yeah, in the absence of any other persons, I mean, we still have 7 minutes. So I want to ask this question. And, there is a very nice book written by a Nigerian that says, Africa, the Bright Continent. Very fascinating work. Another one written by 2 journalists from Chicago, Rwanda Incorporated. I mean, these sometimes when listening to this paper, for all the wonderful things said, it does just paint this apocalyptic picture of Africa or Senegal that is, all wrapped up in this enchanted worldview. Anyone listening would also know that Senegal is the model of democracy West Africa, how Senegal was able to change from one government to President Sall, was among the first country in West Africa that actually successfully voted out an incumbent, and Senegal has a 90% is, by my, I have not done much research on this, but I think in West Africa, Senegal has the highest number percentage-wise of Muslim, where there are 10% of Christians, but there's no terrorism, there's no Boko Haram, there's no Islamic State and all that. So the thing that the question is actually that whether there are things that are actually working in Africa that can contribute to creating a new narrative of history. And I do a lot of work in development. I've done 42 projects in 5 African countries, and whenever I visit these women, I don't see enchantment. Bill was there in Nigeria to see those women. They are governing themselves, over 150 women. They are running their organization, So my question then, sorry, because we still have time, that's why I'm. So my question is, what lenses are you wearing to read the movement of the spirit in history in Africa, broadly conceived?
Again, I didn't mean to be apocalyptic. In fact, I would say I wasn't. But I do say that Senegal, the basic religion is maraboutage. And the only way you would do that is by living there and actually going around, sitting in the law courts, going to these shrines, just visiting things. But the only way you find about Nigerian Pentecostalism is actually going to the churches, week after week, day after day. And I suppose that would be a criticism I would make of many theologians. Even some of the experts on Pentecostalism, Peter Berger, David Martin, that sort of stuff. I think you only have to go to some Nigerian Pentecostals and you would know after 20 minutes. It isn't exactly like that. But so I'm not being apocalyptic, and certainly Senegal was a lovely place to live. Don't exaggerate the extent of democracy, though. Sure, Macky Sall replaced Wade, but so in that sense, it's an elective democracy. But for me, it's not. Well, we're talking about it's not Denmark. But
should it be Denmark?
The point, though,
Is that the paradigm?
Yeah. Denmark is the paradigm.
Is that the paradigm? Yeah, I just don't understand that frame of reference.
See, that we would differ there. I would say Denmark is quite a good model.
It's a lovely place to live, but
Sorry?
Huh? That's fine.
It is an opinion.
Yeah.
Oh, I said it is an opinion.
An opinion? Yes, yeah. But I think it's an opinion that can be defended.
So is the other one.
Oh yeah, sure. And no one argued better than yourself. Yeah, no, sure, it's defensible. But no, there are things. I mean, I didn't want to cite the United States or something like that, because that's a bit more controversial. But the point I was trying to make, Dan, and I think that stands up, the religion in Senegal is basically enchanted and pretty much universally. Okay? I would argue that. And again, it's not a theological opinion, this is a an ethnographic opinion, just going around, staying in villages, talking to people, going to shrines, reading the papers, listening to the talk shows. So it's that groundwork that I would be stressing, and that main point I would stand by. There are plenty of other opinions that could be debated, yeah. I would stand by that.
I will ask you to join me in thanking our super